But let's get started with today's class on externalities. So, I was in the middle of making a video instead of live streaming. I was going to make videos for this class, and I have high standards, so I was going to make them really high quality. And let me put it this way: it took me about 15 hours of work to make 1 minute of content. And maybe such a video on this will be forthcoming because I put in a lot of work, and I'd like to see it get out, and I think it's good. But for now, we'll just be live streaming and talking about things as we go through. So here's the problem. Consent is crucial. Consent is crucial. Consent is the backbone, it's the foundation, it's the building block of our civilization, of our peace and markets and doing nice things for each other. But what is consent? There's questions about implied consent. There's been a lot of discussion on the news about affirmative consent, which is you have to always say yes. You can't assume someone by not saying something is consenting. So they say yes is yes. You need to hear someone say yes, but not always. But in everyday conversation, you don't always have to have someone to say yes in order to have their consent. For example, you could go to a restaurant and they offer you some coffee or tea, and you say yes, and then they pour you the coffee and then walk away, and at the end of it they bring you a bill. They didn't say that they were going to charge you for that coffee, but it was implied because we live in a society where you don't just get coffee for free. On the other hand, they also can't give you a bill at the end of that coffee for $1 million, because having $1 million coffee, that's also unusual. So they would, by context, you would have to ask for permission. There was a video that talked about comparing consent to tea. You can ask someone if they want tea, they can say yes right away, and then by the time you go to make the tea and bring it out to them, they can say no at any time, and that's valid, and that's fine, and that's good. But as economists, we do not deal with the thorny questions of what is and isn't consent. When is consent implied, when it needs to be affirmed, etc. We just take consent as a fact of the world. And now we're trying to understand, what does it mean to have a civilization based on consent, and what could it mean if people are transacting without consent? So we have something. So if you have a situation without consent, that means you have something taken away from you, or have something been given to you without your consent. And in either case, you could have either a cost or a benefit. For example, if you had a car that was rusting on your lot and you couldn't get rid of it, you couldn't sell it, one day you go to sleep and then you wake up and the car is gone. Someone took that car from you without your consent, but maybe you would be better off. On the other hand, someone could give you something without your consent. For example, have you guys heard of the phrase white elephant? A white elephant. A white elephant is a figure of speech that comes from history. There was a country in the East, we'll call it, and the king made it illegal to kill white elephants. It was illegal to kill white elephants because they were so rare and beautiful, etc. But the king still had enemies, and how the king decided to deal with his enemies was that he gave them a gift. He gave them as a gift a white elephant. And I don't know if you guys have ever taken care of elephants before, but they're very expensive to take care of. And effectively, by being gifted a white elephant, the king was dooming his friend or enemy to bankruptcy because it was illegal to kill them. So, it's possible to get things without your consent. It's possible to receive or have things taken away from you without your consent. And in either case, your utility could go up or down. You can benefit or you could suffer. So when we talk about the costs and benefits associated with non-consensual acts, we're calling them externalities. An externality is the cost or benefit of a non-consensual transaction. So, the question is, we have different kinds of externalities. So we have positive externalities, and negative externalities. A positive externality is when you get a benefit from an action that you didn't consent to. A negative externality is when you incur a cost. Most people, when they talk about externalities, they don't even qualify them with this with positive or negative. They simply say that there is an externality, and they typically mean a negative externality. They say, for example, a factory is polluting the air, and the air that's being polluted, that's creating a negative externality for all the people who live around it. But of course, we know that's not the only kind of externality there is. For example, if a woman is wearing nice clothing and she walks down the streets, all of the heterosexual men probably are getting a lot of benefit from getting that, from getting to see that woman walking down that street. So that's a classic case of a positive externality. So that's why we have to be careful when we're talking about externalities. Do we mean positive or negative? So if of course I should point out that in order to even have an externality to begin with, in order to have an externality to begin with, you need other people around. If you are alone on an island, you got an island here, some palm trees, and that's you. And you now have a factory that's emitting smoke. In this situation, are there any externalities at all? The answer is no. There are no externalities at all because there's not another person around. You're not imposing costs on anyone, and no one else is imposing costs or benefits on you. But as soon as one other person comes to the island, then the possibilities for non-consensual behavior is endless. All it takes for something to have the possibility of non-consensual activities to exist, or as we say, externalities to exist, is just two people. Okay. Let me just pause for a minute here. Any questions so far? So first question I see is, there isn't still an environmental externality from pollution? No. So you can only impose externalities on other people. Mother Nature cannot be externalized upon, and Mother Nature can't impose externalities on you either. If Mother Nature gives you good looks, or if Mother Nature makes one leg of yours shorter on another, we don't just say that's an externality. You don't consent to nature. We're coerced. Every single one of us is coerced by nature every day, all the time. Because of this, we don't talk about being coerced by nature, because it happens, it's everything. If you can define everything with a word, then it's useless. So we don't talk about natural, quote unquote, Mother Nature's coercion. So we just ignore that concept altogether, and we just focus on what one person does to another. So let me scroll back in the chat. So what if there are no people but influences of people? So it doesn't matter whether people are on the same island, or if one guy is on another island 1,000 miles away, right? If the smoke from here is going to another person, it doesn't matter how far away that other person is, as long as the cost or the benefits are being imposed on them non-consensually, then that's an externality. What else do we have? Let me see. Yes, externalities only refer to interactions between humans. If someone is causing externalities for others without knowing, is it still an externality? The answer is yes. This guy could be totally ignorant that this other person even exists. If this guy is ignorant that this guy even exists, he's still imposing an externality. It doesn't matter. As the old saying goes, ignorance of the law is not a defense. Just because you don't know that you're hurting someone doesn't stop that other person from being hurt. Doesn't make what you're doing totally okay and inexcusable. Now, the law treats accidental actions differently than intentional actions. The law makes a distinction between murder, for example, and manslaughter. The law makes a difference between justifiable homicide and non-justifiable homicide. Not all killing is murder. The intent of the parties involved is very important. Another example of a positive externality that a lot of people bring up is schooling. People say by education, by educating people, you're creating positive externalities for the rest of society. Because an educated population is a smarter population, is a more productive population, is a more inventive, entrepreneurial population, etc. And so that creates a positive externality. To go back to CBAS 155, yes, in this initial drawing here, the world was only this tiny island, and there was no one else. And then someone else showed up, and then we discovered that there was another man on another island further away. The exam schedule has been changed, and then that's been emailed out. Any other questions before moving on? Okay, so time to move on. So the question is, what do we do about externalities? The most common defense of what to do about externalities is to internalize them. Internalize externalities. What does it mean to internalize an externality? To internalize an externality means to get consent. To internalize an externality means to get consent. Okay? How do we get consent? So let's say we have these two guys on this island, or this guy and this guy on these two different islands. If this guy says that you are imposing a negative externality on me, you got to do something about it, then they can come to an agreement whereby this guy maybe builds a wall around his factory so that the smoke no longer goes over to this guy's island. That would be one example of an internalization. Another example could be that the factory owner, the polluter, just pays. He could just pay cash money to the person that he's harming. Some agreed upon dollar amount. Internalizing is giving or receiving consent. Consent works both ways, right? There are questions about what I'm wearing for pants. I assure you I'm wearing pants. I don't want to touch my camera though. So we have internalization of externalities. We have building walls. We have paying money. There is also a third option, which is a government intervention. Government intervention can come in three forms. It can come in a subsidy, come in a tax, or it can come in a prohibition or injunction. The idea is you want to subsidize positive externalities, and then you want to tax or prohibit negative externalities. How you internalize externalities could be determined either in court or out of court. You do not necessarily need a court, but a court often has to get involved in our society because we have a lot of different laws and legislations working together. And if you guys remember the John Hasnas article, it was the key point of the John Hasnas article from the beginning of the semester on the myth of the rule of law is that it's possible to argue for or against any position if you know if there's enough legislation. You can find legislation that says one thing. You can find legislation that says something the opposite. You can find legislation that the letter of the law is different than the spirit of it, and then you can pit the spirit versus the letter of the law. So you can come to agreements at court or outside of court. How you choose specifically on how you internalize this an externality, or in other words, the question is, why aren't we internalizing all the externalities? Is because of transaction costs. Transaction costs. The question is, when does it pay to have to internalize an externality? And the answer is, you internalize when the benefits exceed the cost. When the benefits of internalization exceeds the cost, then you do it. This could be any sort of internalization, whether it's asking for a cash payment, or whether it's taking it to court, or whether it's lobbying the government to do something about it. For example, if a factory a million miles away is polluting the air and the air particles, I can detect with very precise instruments that the air particles are coming onto my property and they're sullying my clean linens out, drying in the line outside. If we get to that situation, it still might not be in my interest for me to take that issue to court, because the particle matter is so small that the cost of me taking this issue to court would be much larger than the benefit. So, before we move on, any questions on this so far? Waiting a second, and guess no. So, the key thing to remember is that when people say that the cost of a externality is too high, you always compare costs versus benefits. Do not compare costs with other costs. Do not say that the cost of taking an issue to court versus the cost of lobbying the government. The cost would be relatively higher to lobby the government, therefore the transaction costs are too high. That's wrong. You should always be comparing the cost of a internalization versus the benefit of that same internalization. Always compare the costs and benefits of each transaction, of each action. So, let's move on now to the issue of some of the papers. We talk about, there's the Demsetz paper and there's chapter 10 of the textbook. And the Demsetz paper talks about another paper which is pretty interesting. So it's about the something called the people call the Mountainese, or the Inuk, or sorry, the Innu people of Labrador and Newfoundland and Quebec, that area. So the Innu people are natives to eastern Canada, and prior to the arrival of Europeans, they used to hunt beaver for subsistence, for food. And it was, beaver is, a small rodent-looking thing. Apparently it's not very tasty, but the beavers had a very low value. Until the Europeans came, and they decided that they really, really liked beaver fur. And they like to make beaver hats and wear other things made out of beavers. And what do you think? So let's draw our famous supply and demand graph for beavers. So this was the price of beavers, and this was the quantity of beavers prior to the arrival of the Europeans. And then when the Europeans arrived, and they really, really liked beaver pelt and making beaver hats and stuff, which changed? Demand or supply? Demand. Of course, demand shifted way out. So the price went way up, and the quantity supplied and demanded went way up. So because the price of beavers went so increased so drastically, we had the situation where the natives, they now had an incentive to hunt more beavers than they used to before. And this led to some problems because initially, when the beavers are just out in the wild and no one owned them and no one owned the land, and because they had such low value, and suddenly when there's a big demand shift, we have the situation where we have a tragedy of the commons. We talked about in the previous session on governance and governments. And when we have this tragedy of the commons, the supply of the animal, the supply of the good, decreases very quickly because nobody has an incentive to take care of the supply individually, and so everyone overuses. You see the same situation happening right now with toilet paper. There's only so much toilet paper, and stores aren't raising the price of toilet paper or even putting quantity controls on toilet paper. So people are just coming in and taking. The first guy's taking as many bags of it as he can, as many rolls as he can, and then at least fewer for the next people. But what the Innu people did was more clever than what Walmart and Costco were doing. They created property rights. They created property rights in the beaver habitat. And when they created this the property rights regime, they had the rivers there, and they said some beavers live here, some beavers live there, and then they created and then they roam like this way. They created quasi riparian rights and quasi and actual property rights, and they assigned each habitat, we call this habitat 1, habitat 2, to different families of the people. They spontaneously created these property rights. They didn't learn this from the Europeans. They just wanted to maximize their own personal gain from beaver sales. So what we had was the people spontaneously inventing these riparian rights and other property rights in real time in the 1700s. The same wasn't true, however, in the southwest of the United States. In the southwest of the United States, that's New Mexico, California, the deserts there. Those are arid lands, not much there. The people there are much more spread out, and the animals there, they don't tend to, because there's no centralized source of food, the animals tend to graze a lot, and they migrate, and they migrate across huge swaths of land. And even after the Europeans came, which and even to this day, the population density of the west of North America is nowhere near as dense as it is as here. It never made sense for them to domesticate or create property rights in buffalo and other large herding and migrating mammals. So I'm seeing some activity in the chat. Let's see what's happening. Let's go back. So why do you have to read and send me some papers? Okay. So one person's asking or claiming that we genocided the beavers, but at least they made it onto the money. So people say that's a big rodent W. That could be one way of thinking about it. But let's actually talk about what happened to the beaver. So we still have beaver in this country. They're still roaming free. It's not as many as they used to be. They used to be real pests. It used to be a big problem. There was a big beaver problem. They would come into your land and they chew down the trees and destroy your property, etc. So people thought of beavers as pests, and they actually tried to exterminate them to some extent. But it's interesting to note how human behavior around animals and farming is so different than wild animal behavior. In a situation, so a beaver's natural habitat or natural predators might be eagles and bears, for example. I don't know actually what eats beavers, but if we just say it was bears, then if the amount of bears in an area increases, then we know for sure then the amount of beavers in that area will decrease. Right? More bears mean they need to eat more beavers, and they're just going to eat all the beavers. If we introduce a whole bunch of bears, then they very quickly will eat all the beavers. But it's not the same for domesticated animals. Human beings have figured out how to create more animals when there's more demand for animals. Isn't that interesting? When there's a famous story, or there's a famous quote by an old ecologist who says that both the hawk and a person and people eat chickens, but the more hawks, the fewer chickens, but the more people, the more chickens. It's because people have been clever enough to invent farming, to invent property rights, to create incentives for breeding and creating more chickens. Now you can talk about the ethics behind that, but the issue is we still have figured out how to make more. Let's see. We got one person talking about the supply of hand sanitizers, buying up the supply of hand sanitizer that the healthcare workers need certainly qualifies as malicious. Well, people need all sorts of things. How is anyone supposed to know what someone else actually needs though? When you go to the store and you see hand sanitizers for sale, how do you know that the healthcare workers haven't already come up and taken their fair share? Or how do you know that they haven't come and taken its private delivery? We don't know that information. We just know that what's available for sale and the price that it's available for sale. The price is what communicates to us the relative needs that other people have. So, what if the beaver is COVID-19? Our old friend Harambe. The story of Harambe, the tragedy. What's your outlook on the production of respirators? The situation with respirators is actually pretty interesting. We have respirators are complicated instruments. They are made with there's a lot of intellectual property, that's patents and copyrights and trademarks involved, but it's mostly patents that are dealing with the manufacture of respirators. And the explicit purpose of a patent is to restrict supply. It's to restrict supply so that the person who invented the good in the first place gets to earn extra normal profits, extra high profits by restricting the supply, by having zero competitors. You guys might have heard of Theranos, which was some 19-year-old started this company that ended up attracting over $1 billion in investments. And it turned out to be a total scam. They were alleging that they can take just a single drop of blood and they can test for over 100 diseases from that single drop of blood. It was a complete and utter scam. But they had a lot of scientists, and they were creating and filing a lot of patents. And the news reported a few, I guess, last week or 2 weeks ago, that a company bought up all the patents from this bankrupt company, Theranos. And one of the patents that they bought revolved around respirators. And that they're now going after another company and threatening them with not making, or ventilators, or one of these technologies that's needed for dealing with this health issue. And they threatened to shut them down unless they gave them some money. This behavior is called patent trolling. Patent trolling, where you have a patent that you don't intend to use to make your own products with, and instead you just sue other people for money. People complain about patent trolling as saying that it's malicious and that it's counterproductive, etc. But compare patent trolling with genuine use of patents. And when a genuine use of patent arises, what the company actually does when they enforce their patent is that they want to shut down competition in total. When Apple sues Microsoft for infringing a patent, they're trying to stop Microsoft from competing with them altogether. Patent trolls, on the other hand, they just want a taste. They just want some extra cash. They just want some royalties. They want to let you make, but they just want a cut of your profits. Now you tell me, which is worse? A company that makes goods a company that allows people to use its patents for a fee, or a company that stops competition altogether by getting injunctions against patent infringers. Obviously, having more of stuff is good, is better than having less of stuff. And the whole purpose of patents is to stop this behavior, is to stop other people from competing with you. And patent trolls, they've just they're not asking, they're not the bad guys here. The bad guys is the patent system that allows you to stop competition and to increase prices to begin with. So don't be mad at patent trolls. That's a good question. So we have a question. Why are the night lights of Paris patented? It's actually copyrighted, and it's not all of Paris. It's the Eiffel Tower. So the Eiffel Tower itself is not subject to copyright or patent or anything else. It was invented too long ago, before all this nonsense really took off. Instead, they lined up the tower with lights, and they've then gave themselves a copyright in the pattern of lighting for the Eiffel Tower. So it's now perfectly legal to take pictures of the Eiffel Tower during the daytime or when the lights are off. But when the lights are on, you're now infringing on the copyright of the Eiffel Tower owner. And they can stop you from publishing your pictures, etc. Question is, are injunctions always involved with violating patents? Violating patents always gives you the opportunity to ask for an injunction, but patent trolls don't want injunctions. They want a royalty. They want you to make your goods because they want you to make money, but they just want a cut of that profit. They're just taking advantage of an already legal system. The problem with the patent system isn't patent trolling. Patent trolling is actually a benefit, a good thing from the legal, from a utility perspective. Copyrights are just like patents, except even worse. Copyrights in the United States now, they last for the life of the author plus 70 years. That could be over 150 years worth of patents or worth of protections. That's how Mickey Mouse is still under copyright. And copyrights, the original history behind copyrights was to prevent people from copying books illegally. And competing with book publishers. Copyrights were never about protecting authors. It was always about protecting publishers. Copyrights were also used for stopping free speech. You use your own pen and paper to reprint something that someone else said or wrote, and you're infringing copyright. They can stop you from using your own property as you see fit. Going back, one question, imagine you spend your resources on making something when you can finally start making money out of the product, trolls come in and steal from your hard work. That sounds uncomfortable, but that also just sounds like normal competition, right? Imagine when somebody puts up a new McDonald's franchise or Tim Hortons franchise, they're putting in a lot of their hard work and money. But if somebody comes in across the street with a Burger King or a Starbucks, they're stealing their profits too, stealing. But the thing is, with patents and competition is always consensual, right? Between the competitors, between the buyer and seller. So you are a seller 1, and here are some buyers, buyer 1 and buyer 2, and then here's seller 2. Both of you guys want to sell to the buyers. You're offering at one price, he's offering at another price. If the buyers voluntarily choose to give their money to seller 2, what difference does it make whether you had a patent or not? Not everything is patented. That's another thing you should notice. Because patents were invented by governments willy-nilly over the last couple hundred years, it's just the most obvious case of making things up as you go along. For example, you can get a patent on boat hull designs, but you cannot get a patent or copyright on articles of clothing. You cannot patent, so you can patent a boat hull design, but you can't patent a car design. If Ferrari comes out with a car that looks like this vaguely, Ford can come out with another car that looks exactly like this. And that wouldn't be a patent violation. But if Ferrari makes a boat hull that looks like this, and then Ford comes along and makes the identical boat hull, they would be guilty of violating a patent or infringing upon a patent. The argument for patents has to do with negative externalities, but it's weak because externalities, as we said, are about consent. And when you quote-unquote steal somebody's patents, which means you're just copying their idea, you did everything by consent. You bought your own equipment to make your copy with consent, presumably, and you're selling it to customers also with consent. The only person who didn't consent is the guy who's being competed with, but he has no right to. It's not his business because, well, it's literally his business, but no one is taking his physical stuff. No one is taking his property, but we've invented this concept of intellectual property, and we've given it the name intellectual property, and people just think it should be treated like normal property. One person is saying, we're paying a bunch of money to attend your class, and I'm going to start stealing your classes put online for cheaper. I understand that you're not even in this class, but you're a couple steps behind. My lectures are already available online for free. But the issue is, this is always an empty threat. It's always an empty threat. If you want to take my lectures, put them online for free, and you get more people to watch them, that's better for me. If you want to pretend that you've written Harry Potter, in my view, you should go for it. But I think most people will recognize that there can't be 100 people who wrote the same Harry Potter book. How do you fill a threat? I meant fulfill a threat. people always threaten when you bring up the issue of patents and how there shouldn't be any patents or copyrights. People say, "Oh, what if I steal one of your inventions and sell it for cheaper?" Well, that's called competition, and go for it. But these people never follow through on their threats. I have lots of stuff that lots of ideas that they can come and steal, but they don't. They don't steal any of these ideas because to steal an idea means you have to create a business. And to create a business involves risks, involves time, involves effort and money. And these people, they just make empty threats. Anyway, we're coming up to the end of the class. Any final questions? All right, guys. Thank you so much. I will see you on Wednesday.